All right, so you ready to explore some seriously thought-provoking stuff
I
today?
am.
Okay, perfect.
Always.
We are going to be diving into a clip from a religious podcast called thickshades.com, specifically an episode called Reflections of Darkness.
Ooh.
Okay, the title alone is pretty intense, right?
Yeah, it definitely grabs your attention.
It does.
Makes you think, what kind of darkness are we talking about here?
Exactly. So this episode is all about how people might be unintentionally mirroring some of Satan's characteristics in their everyday lives.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty fascinating idea. Honestly, it made me stop and think, are there things we do without even realizing that could have a deeper spiritual significance?
Yeah, that's a question that's resonated with people you know for centuries. This podcast specifically uses a passage from Proverbs, chapter 6, verses 16 through 19 as its jumping off point. It lists these 7 things that the Lord finds just detestable, calling them abominations.
Okay, so what are they?
What are these 7 abominations?
Yeah, lay 'em on me.
All right, so it lists a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked imaginations, feet that are swift in running to mischief, a false witness who speaks lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren.
Wow, that's quite a list.
Yeah,
And so this podcast connects these to Satan.
exactly.
Okay.
The argument is when we embody these actions, we're reflecting aspects of Satan, who's often seen as the embodiment of deceit, evil, all that bad stuff.
Okay, so love for us to unpack this starting with pride. What's the connection that the podcast makes between Satan's pride and our own human tendencies?
Sure. So they draw a parallel between Satan's desire to be like God, his ultimate act of pride, and how we can sometimes fall into self-righteousness, entitlement. It's that feeling of being better than others or deserving of special treatment. That can be a subtle form of pride.
It's interesting, right? Because pride is often seen as a positive trait in our society. We're
Yep.
told to be proud of our accomplishments, our identities. But this podcast seems to be suggesting that there's a darker side to pride. This kind of pride that can actually distance us from others and potentially from a sense of spiritual grounding.
Absolutely. And they bring in Proverbs 16.18 to support this. Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Humility is the antidote to pride.
Yeah.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, what about the lying tongue? That seems pretty straightforward.
On the surface, yes, but the podcast takes it a step further. They emphasize that Satan is often called the father of lies. They argue that even seemingly small lies, those white lies we tell to avoid awkwardness or protect ourselves, can still align us with that deceptive energy.
So it's not just about telling huge malicious lies,
Yeah.
but even those little fibs we tell ourselves and others can still have a spiritual impact.
That's their argument. They stress the importance of honesty and transparency in all our interactions, recognizing that even small deceptions can erode trust and ultimately contribute to a more negative environment, like a snowball effect. Starting small, but potentially leading to something bigger and more harmful.
Interesting take. It makes you think twice about those little white lies we tell and dismiss as harmless.
Right. It's about being mindful of the ripple effects of our words and actions, even the ones that seem insignificant.
Okay, let's go to hands that shed innocent blood. This seems pretty intense. Are we talking literally about murder here?
It might seem that way at first glance, but they expand it beyond physical violence. They bring in things like character assassination, gossip, slander, even cyberbullying.
Wow.
The argument is that any action that unjustly harms another person, whether physically or emotionally, can be seen as a form of shedding innocent blood.
So even if we're not physically hurting someone, our words and actions can still inflict deep wounds.
Exactly. Think about emotional damage caused by rumors, betrayal, or public humiliation.
Right.
Those wounds can be just as real and long-lasting as physical ones.
And those are incredibly common, especially in the age of social media.
Yeah.
It's almost like a cultural norm to tear people down online or just spread negativity.
That's a great point, and the podcast challenges us to break free from that, to be mindful of the power of our words, and to consider the impact our actions might have on others.
They connect this to 1 John 3.15, right?
Yes.
The verse that says, "Whoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him."
Powerful verse that highlights the spiritual weight of harboring hatred and ill will towards others.
Okay, let's move on to a heart that devises wicked imaginations.
Yeah.
This feels a little more internal, less about outward actions and more about our thoughts and intentions.
Exactly. It dives into the dangers of negativity festering within us. Things like anger, envy, resentment, thoughts of revenge. The idea is that these negative emotions, if left unchecked, can actually defile us spiritually and make us more susceptible to negative influences.
So it's not just about what we do, but also about what we think and feel.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that our inner world, our thoughts and intentions, are just as important as our outward actions. And the podcast argues that if we allow our hearts and minds to dwell on negativity, it creates a toxic inner environment that can spill out into our actions and affect our relationships.
It's almost like they're saying that harboring these negative emotions is like inviting darkness into our lives.
Yes, and they use Mark 7.2123, which talks about how evil thoughts defile a person, to back up this point.
So it's a call to guard our hearts and minds, choosing to focus on thoughts and intentions that are pure, loving, and constructive.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a positive inner landscape that can then manifest as positive actions in the world.
Okay, next up. Feet that are swift in running to mischief. I'm curious to hear how they unpack this one.
Yeah, well, this one's all about our tendency to seek out drama and conflict. You know, those who thrive on chaos, revel in stirring up trouble? They're essentially aligning themselves with a more disruptive energy.
So it's about recognizing our own tendencies towards drama and choosing to step away from situations that might feed that negativity.
Exactly. And they connect this to Proverbs 1.1 scene, which says, "For their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood."
Wow. That's pretty intense imagery.
Yeah, it is. But it highlights the stark contrast between choosing a path of peace and unity versus a path of conflict and harm.
So it's not just about avoiding causing trouble ourselves, but also about recognizing when we're getting sucked into other people's drama and choosing to disengage from that negativity.
That's a great point. It's about consciously choosing to be a calming presence, a force for peace, rather than contributing to the chaos.
Okay, now we have a false witness who speaks lies. This feels like an extension of the lying tongue, but maybe with a broader scope.
Yeah, you're right. This one goes beyond simply telling lies ourselves and focuses on the damage caused by spreading rumors, twisting the truth, or bearing false witness against others, especially in a way that could impact justice or damage relationships.
So it's about being mindful of the information we share and making sure we're not perpetuating falsehoods, even if we're not the original source of the lie.
Exactly. And they argue that, actions like exaggerating stories to make ourselves look better, spreading rumors without verifying their truthfulness, or omitting crucial details to paint a misleading picture can all be considered forms of false witness.
It's like those situations where someone might take a situation out of context to make someone else look bad, even if the facts themselves aren't entirely false.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that manipulating information, even if it doesn't involve outright lying, can still be incredibly damaging and can ultimately contribute to a culture of distrust and suspicion.
And this kind of behavior is so prevalent, especially online.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're constantly bombarded with misinformation and half-truths, which makes it even harder to discern what's real and what's not.
That's a great point, and it highlights the importance of being critical thinkers, of questioning the information we encounter, and of striving to uphold truth and accuracy even when it's inconvenient or challenging.
Okay, on to the last one. Someone who sows discord among brethren. This seems particularly relevant in today's world where division and polarization seem to be everywhere.
It certainly does. The podcast emphasizes how division is often seen as a tactic of darkness, a way to weaken communities and prevent them from achieving common goals.
So they're saying that those who intentionally create conflict, spread gossip, or stir up resentment are essentially working against a more unified and harmonious future.
That's their argument. And they specifically mention how this is especially damaging within faith communities, where shared values and beliefs should ideally bring people together.
It's like they're saying that focusing on our differences rather than our commonalities can ultimately lead to a breakdown of community and connection.
Exactly. And they highlight the importance of seeking understanding, of building bridges rather than walls, and of remembering that unity doesn't require uniformity.
So even if we disagree with someone, the focus should be on finding common ground and working towards shared goals.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that diversity of thought and perspective can actually strengthen a community, but only if there's a foundation of respect and a willingness to engage in constructive dialogue.
Wow, that was quite a journey through those 7 abominations.
Yeah.
It's amazing how they managed to connect these seemingly disparate behaviors to a common theme.
It is interesting, right? It's not just about following a set of rules, but about understanding the deeper implications of our choices and recognizing that even seemingly small actions can have ripple effects, either positive or negative.
It's like a call to be more conscious, more intentional, and to really examine our motivations before we act.
Exactly. And speaking of intention, this podcast episode also features a thought-provoking poem called Reflections of Darkness.
Oh, really?
It's a poetic summary of everything we've been talking about, emphasizing the need to recognize and reject darkness within ourselves.
I'd love to dive into that poem in more detail, but I think we'll save that for the next part of our deep dive. For now, I want to leave our listeners with this question. What stood out to you the most from this list of abominations? Was there one that resonated with you more than others? Maybe one that made you think differently about your own behaviors or the behaviors you see in the world around you?
It's definitely a lot to absorb, and I'm sure our listeners have their own thoughts and reactions to these concepts. But what's fascinating to me is how this podcast highlights that our actions aren't just personal choices. They can actually reflect a deeper spiritual alignment, either with forces of darkness or with a more positive, loving energy.
That's a great point. It's like we're all constantly making choices that either contribute to a more positive or a more negative world. And being aware of that power, that influence we have, can be incredibly empowering.
Exactly. And it's a responsibility we all share. It's a lot to consider, isn't it? This idea that even our seemingly small choices can reflect these larger spiritual patterns.
It really is. And I think that's what makes this whole concept so intriguing.
Yeah.
It's not just about avoiding big, obviously bad things,
Right.
but of developing a deeper awareness of the energy we're putting out into the world through our everyday actions.
Exactly. And it's not about getting bogged down in guilt or feeling like we need to be perfect all the time. It's more about cultivating that awareness, like you said, and making conscious choices whenever possible.
Right. It's like we're all works in progress, and every moment is a chance to choose a more positive path.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of choosing a more positive path, the podcast actually offers some guidance in that regard. They talk about the importance of cultivating what they call the fruits of the spirit.
Oh, yeah.
As antidotes to those negative tendencies we were discussing earlier.
The fruits of the Spirit. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah.
What exactly are those?
Well, the podcast references a passage from Galatians 5.22223, which lists them as love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control.
That's quite a list. And it sounds like these qualities are meant to be the opposite of those abominations.
Exactly. Think of it as a toolkit for spiritual growth. Each fruit represents a positive quality we can cultivate to counteract those negative tendencies.
So, for example, instead of giving into pride and that feeling of superiority, we can practice humility and gratitude.
Right. And instead of letting our anger fester, we can choose patience and understanding.
Instead of spreading gossip or engaging in character assassination, we can choose kindness and compassion.
Exactly. It's about making a conscious effort to shift our focus from darkness to light, from negativity to positivity, both within ourselves and in our interactions with others.
It's interesting because these fruits of the Spirit aren't just religious concepts. They're qualities that are valued in pretty much every culture and society.
That's a great point. There are universal principles that contribute to a more harmonious and fulfilling life, regardless of your spiritual beliefs.
Okay, so let's talk about that poem, Reflections of Darkness. What kind of imagery or metaphors does it use to convey this idea of recognizing and rejecting darkness within ourselves?
Well, the poem is quite evocative. It talks about darkness as a shadow that follows us, tempting us with whispers of doubt, fear, and anger. It describes how darkness can disguise itself as something alluring, promising power or pleasure, but ultimately leading to pain and isolation.
It's interesting,
Yeah.
right? Because we often think of darkness as something external, something separate from ourselves. But this poem seems to be suggesting that darkness can also reside within us, in our own thoughts, desires, and motivations.
Exactly. And the poem emphasizes that recognizing that inner darkness is the first step towards overcoming it. It's about acknowledging those shadow aspects of ourselves, those tendencies we might try to hide or deny, and then consciously choosing to turn towards the light.
So it's not about denying our flaws or pretending we're perfect, but about being honest with ourselves about the areas where we might be tempted to give in to those negative impulses.
Right. It's about having the courage to look within, to confront those shadow parts of ourselves with compassion and understanding, and then to choose a different path, a path that aligns with our highest values and aspirations.
That's a powerful message. It's like they're saying that true strength comes from acknowledging our vulnerabilities and then consciously choosing to rise above them.
Exactly. And the poem also emphasizes that this isn't a journey we have to take alone. It talks about the importance of seeking guidance from those who embody the light, those who can help us navigate through our own inner darkness and find our way back to a place of wholeness and peace.
So it's about surrounding ourselves with positive influences, with people who inspire us to be our best selves.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that we have the power to be that positive influence for others.
It's like that saying, be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. If we want to see more love, kindness, and compassion in the world, we need to start by embodying those qualities ourselves.
This conversation has really gotten me thinking. We've talked about these seven abominations, which can seem pretty heavy and maybe even a little abstract. But I think it's important to remember that they're ultimately just metaphors, ways of understanding the different ways that negativity can manifest in our lives.
That's a good point. It's not about getting caught up in the specific terminology or the religious context. It's about recognizing the underlying principles at play and understanding how those principles can show up in our everyday lives.
Right. So even if someone isn't familiar with the Bible or doesn't subscribe to a particular religious belief system, they can still relate to these concepts on a human level.
Absolutely, because we all experience those negative emotions, those temptations to act in ways that are harmful to ourselves or others. We all have those shadow aspects of ourselves that we might try to hide or deny.
So how do we actually go about cultivating these fruits of the Spirit and resisting those negative tendencies on a daily basis? It's easy to talk about it in theory, but putting it into practice can be challenging. What are some practical tips or exercises we can incorporate into our lives?
Well, I think one of the most powerful practices is mindfulness. It's about paying attention to our thoughts, emotions, and actions throughout the day, becoming more aware of the choices we're making and the motivations behind them.
So it's like a mental check-in throughout the day, taking a few moments to pause and observe what's going on inside us.
Exactly. It could be as simple as taking a few deep breaths and asking yourself, what am I feeling right now? What thoughts are running through my mind? Are my actions aligned with my values?
That's a great idea. It's
Mhm.
like hitting the pause button on autopilot and taking a moment to consciously choose our next step.
Precisely. Another helpful practice is to cultivate a gratitude practice. Focusing on the things we're grateful for can help shift our mindset from negativity to positivity.
So instead of dwelling on what's wrong or what we lack, we can choose to appreciate the good things in our lives, even the small ones.
Exactly. It could be as simple as keeping a gratitude journal, writing down a few things we're thankful for each day. Or it could be taking a moment to savor a beautiful sunset or a delicious meal.
I love that. It's about training ourselves to notice and appreciate the abundance that already surrounds us.
Right. And when we focus on gratitude, it becomes easier to resist the pull of negativity and make choices that align with a more positive and joyful outlook.
It's like we're reprogramming our brains to seek out the good instead of getting bogged down in the bad.
Exactly. And as we cultivate these positive qualities and make more conscious choices, we begin to create a more positive and uplifting energy field around us.
It's fascinating because this all ties back to that idea of interconnectedness that we were talking about earlier. It's like our individual choices and actions don't just affect ourselves. They ripple outward and impact the people around us, our communities, and even the world as a whole.
That's a profound insight, and I think it's a key takeaway from this whole conversation. We're not isolated individuals, we're all part of a larger web of life.
Hmm.
And the quality of our individual contributions can either strengthen or weaken that web.
So if we want to see a more loving, compassionate, and unified world, we need to start by cultivating those qualities within ourselves and then radiating them outwards.
Absolutely. It's about embodying the change we want to see, being the light in the darkness, and inspiring others to do the same.
This has been such an insightful conversation. It's really challenged me to think more deeply about my own choices and actions and to consider the ripple effects they might be creating.
Me too. And I hope our listeners are having a similar experience.
I'm sure they are. This is the kind of stuff that really makes you stop and think. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. How can we practically integrate those fruits of the Spirit into our daily lives? What are some small but meaningful steps we can take to embody those qualities more fully?
That's a great question, and I think it's something each of us needs to explore for ourselves. But I believe the key is to start small, to choose one area where you want to grow, and then to make a conscious effort to practice that quality every day.
So it's about making small, incremental changes rather than trying to overhaul our entire lives overnight.
Exactly. It's about taking baby steps, celebrating our progress, and being patient with ourselves along the way.
It's like building a muscle. The more we exercise it, the stronger it becomes.
Exactly. And as those fruits of the spirit become more ingrained in our being, we'll naturally start to make choices that reflect those qualities.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. But I'm eager to hear more about your insights in the next part of our deep dive, especially about how this all connects to the bigger picture of our spiritual journeys.
I'm looking forward to diving deeper into that as well.
It's amazing how this deep dive has taken us from exploring these abominations, which sound pretty intense, to considering these beautiful fruits of the Spirit. It feels like we've gone on a real journey here.
It has been quite a journey, hasn't it? And I think that's the nature of any meaningful exploration. We often start in one place and end up somewhere completely unexpected.
That's so true. And I think what's been most striking for me is this idea that our actions aren't just isolated events.
Yeah.
They're reflections of a deeper alignment, a choice between light and darkness, positivity and negativity.
I agree. And it's not about judging ourselves or others for those choices. It's
Yeah.
about recognizing that we always have the power to choose again, to shift our alignment, to cultivate those qualities that lead to greater peace, joy, and connection.
It's almost like we're constantly calibrating our internal compass, making sure it's pointing us in the right direction.
That's a beautiful analogy. And sometimes that calibration involves confronting those shadow aspects of ourselves, those tendencies that might lead us astray. But it's through that confrontation, that willingness to look within, that we can truly grow and evolve.
It's like those abominations and fruits of the Spirit are two sides of the same coin. You know, they represent the spectrum of human potential, the choices we face every day, the ongoing struggle between darkness and light that exists within each of us.
That's a profound way to put it. And it reminds us that we're all on this journey together. We all have those moments where we stumble or fall short. But it's through those moments, those challenges, that we learn and grow the most.
And it's those moments that make the fruits of the Spirit all the more valuable, right? Because when we face adversity, when we're tempted to give in to anger, fear, or despair, those qualities of love, patience, kindness, and self-control become our anchors, our guiding lights.
Exactly. They provide us with the strength and resilience we need to navigate through difficult times and to emerge from those challenges even stronger and more compassionate than before.
You know what I find really inspiring about this whole concept is that it empowers us to take responsibility for our own spiritual growth. It's not about waiting for some external force to save us or fix us. It's about recognizing that we have the power within ourselves to choose a more positive path.
I agree. And it's a lifelong journey. It's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of enlightenment. It's about showing up every day and making the best choices we can with the awareness and resources we have available to us.
And it's about being patient and compassionate with ourselves along the way.
Absolutely. Because we're all works in progress, always evolving, always learning.
It's like we're all on this giant spiral staircase, constantly ascending towards greater awareness, greater love, greater connection. And sometimes we might trip or stumble, but we can always pick ourselves back up and keep climbing.
That's a beautiful image. And it reminds us that even though the journey might be challenging at times, it's ultimately leading us towards something truly magnificent.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. We've explored some complex and challenging concepts, but I feel like we've emerged from this conversation with a renewed sense of hope and possibility.
Me too. And I think that's the ultimate takeaway from this whole exploration. Yes, there are forces of darkness in the world, both within and around us, but there's also an incredible power within each of us to choose light, to cultivate love, to be a force for good in the world.
So well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage our listeners to reflect on what resonated with them the most from this conversation. What are you taking away from this exploration of reflections of darkness? What seeds of awareness or inspiration have been planted within you?
And more importantly, how can you translate those insights into action? How can you embody those fruits of the spirit more fully in your own life? What small but meaningful steps can you take today to create a more positive ripple effect in the world?
We hope this deep dive has provided you with some valuable tools and perspectives to support you on your own journey of growth and transformation. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep